Hello there, my name is Sarah Cheney Gambon, and I'm a reporter on the Wall Street Journal's economics team with a focus on the labor market. I'm excited to moderate today's webinar on the OECD's employment outlook. Over the past few years, we've seen a lot of interesting developments in the labor market, including the recent launch of ChatGPT, a form of generative artificial intelligence. The OECD Employment Outlook focuses on AI's labor market impact, and today we will get to hear from policy experts and economists in the space about the many risks and benefits of AI. We'll start off with a presentation on the OECD Employment Outlook, followed by a moderated Q&A. I'd like to first introduce today's speakers. On the panel, we have Amanda Ballantyne, who is the executive director of the AFL-CIO's Technology Institute. We have David Barnes, who leads IBM's Global Agenda and Workforce Public Policy and is based in Washington, DC. We have James Besson, an economist and technologist who serves as executive director of the Technology and Policy Research Initiative at Boston University. We have Steen Brugge, who is a senior economist at the OECD, where he leads the organization's Future of Work initiative. We have Joelle Gamble, who serves as the deputy director of the Biden-Harris National Economic Council. We have Stefano Scarpetta, who is the director of the Employment, Labor, and Social Affairs Directorate of the OECD. And we have Andrea Garnered, who is a labor economist at the OECD. Now I'd like to hand it over to the OECD for their Employment Outlook presentation.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Good morning to all of you. It's indeed a great pleasure to be here to present the 2023 edition of the OECD Employment Outlook. This is the cover of the publication. The way in which we are planning to organize the presentation of the main findings of the Outlook is that I will focus on the latest development on the labor market situation of the OECD countries, and then my colleague Steen will focus more on some of the evidence on the impact of artificial intelligence on the labor market. So let me start with the labor market situation. And let me start actually with some good news. I think across the OECD countries, as you can see in this slide, the employment level fully recovered the pre-pandemic levels. So in terms of employment, we are 3% above the pre-pandemic level. This is the case also in the United States. There's only one among the large OECD countries where the level of employment is below the pre-pandemic. This is Japan, but not because the employment rate is below, but simply because through the demographic changes, the people of working age have actually declined. Related to that is also that when we look at the unemployment rate, and for here we are presenting the latest statistics for the United States. As we know, we have actually the data for June. We are at a record low level in many countries of the OECD. In this slide, you see the last observation that for most countries is May, and then the pre-crisis level in December of 2019. You can see that the little diamond for most of the countries is actually above the bar, which is the current level of the unemployment. In some countries, actually, we are looking at unemployment rate that we're not seeing for decades. In the case of France, where we are, you have to go back to 1982 to find a level of unemployment that took place then. In the US, there has been some very modest increase in the unemployment rate from January to the latest statistic we have in June, but still we are at a very low level as well. And in my view, the other important point is when we look at the participation rate, you can see that not always, but in most of the countries, the participation rate has recovered, and in many countries above the pre-pandemic level. We know that during the pandemic, quite a few people of different working age have actually left the labor market temporarily. And in the case of the US, it took a significant amount of time for them to be back into the labor market. But I think it's good to say that basically in the US, the labor force participation rate is at the level of the pre-pandemic. It is higher than that in a number of countries. And what is also interesting when we look at groups, the recovery has been across the board, including among older workers, many of whom have actually temporarily left the labor market during the pandemic. This is actually not the case in the United States, where older workers, the 55 plus, have not yet recovered the pre-pandemic level in terms of participation to the labor market. Another very clear signal of the significant tightness in the labor market in many countries, including, of course, in the United States, is when we look at the vacancies per unemployed person. This is the left chart you have in this slide. You can see that in the US, we move from 1.2, so 1.2 vacancies per job seeker, to actually a level which is more in the range of 1.8. We are not at the peak, that is the little triangle you have in this slide, but we are still at a very high level. To some extent, I would say even historical level. Of course, vacancy per unemployed are much lower in other countries of the OECD, but in many of them, we are still at a significant high level, sometimes higher than what we have seen in many years. Now, if you look at the right-hand side slide, here we are looking at online job postings. So these are very sort of high-frequency data. In fact, we have data even for May of this year. And you can see that in most of the country, there's been a deceleration of the vacancies posted online. This is not surprising because, as we all know, there has been a significant slowdown in economic activity, to some extent less in the United States, where we moved from 3% of GDP growth last year to 1.4, from 2% to 1.6% this year. But if you look at the OECD as a whole, we have moved from 3% to 1.4%. So basically, economic growth has halved in the OECD country as a whole, and has declined even more in the European countries, where, of course, the cost of energy has been a big driver of the slowdown in economic growth, a big drag, I shall say, to economic growth. So there is still tightness in the labor market, despite a significant deceleration in economic activity, and there is shortage of labor in many sectors, not only in some of the sectors where there are structural sort of shortage of labor, including the high-tech sectors, but actually across the board, including construction, in agriculture, and in the service sector. The other interesting point that we have in the outlook I'd like to share with you is also that when we go beyond the pay and we look at the broader package of offer that employer put forward to recruit new workers in a context of a tight labor market, we do observe that a number of benefits have been increased. In the United States, in Canada, in the UK, we saw an increase in the share of online job posting offering employee benefit, especially health-related benefit, including dental vision, life insurance, retirement program, and scheme to pay time off. There are differences across the board. In the US and Canada, this particular health-related benefit. In the UK, it's more retirement benefit or paid for time off or for sick leave. So one dimension is that there's been a sort of an improvement in the packages of the job offering, going beyond the pay and actually looking as well at the other elements of the benefit package that goes to the worker. Now, these were a number of sort of more positive, if you like, findings we observe in the labor market. Again, let me reiterate this point in a context in which economic activity has been slowing down, to some extent in the US, but much more in many other OECD countries, including, of course, the European country. The less positive outcomes we do observe in the labor market is on the wage side. Here you have the evolution of nominal wages, which is the little diamond you see in the more light color. But then when you look at how nominal wage have evolved compared to inflation, you see that in most of the OECD countries, actually real wages have declined. On average, over the past year, so from the first quarter of 23 to from the first quarter of 22 to the first quarter of 23, the decline across the OECD country has been 3.8%. Nominal wage growth in the last few months actually allow in the United States to real wages to keep the level to some extent. So the US is to some extent an exception because the very tight labor market has led to a more significant increase also in nominal wage. Associated with that, and here I move also into some of the policy response that many countries put in place, is looking at the evolution of wages at the lower end of the wage distribution. Here you have the statistics from the statutory minimum wage for the 30 countries, a selection of the 30 countries for which we have data. And what is interesting to note is that there has been a much stronger increase in nominal minimum wages, which meant, if you look at the little triangle, that the real minimum wages have kept pace, basically remained constant over from December of 2020 to May of 2023. In some countries, as you know, probably there is an automatic indexation of the minimum wage to inflation. This is the case in the country in which we are, in France, in which the government has increased on a very high frequency, I shall say, compared to the past history, the nominal minimum wage. In other countries, there's been a decision by the government to hike the minimum wage to make sure that at least the low-paid workers were protected from the significant decline otherwise in the level of income. Now, for the US, we know, and this is what you have all on the left-hand side of this slide, that the federal minimum wage has not been increased since actually 2009, yet a number of states and local areas have actually raised their own minimum wage. So if you look at the one which is more in the middle of the slide, then you can see that this minimum wage, which is a weighted average of the states for which we have the data, actually there, the minimum wage has kept basically, the real minimum wage remain almost constant. So a lot of action to try to protect at least the low-paid workers, those at the minimum wage, against the potential disproportionate effect of very high level of inflation. We know that low-income household, the increase in energy and food prices for them is much, much more important than for other households because they spend a larger share of their total disposable income on energy and the food. I think it's also interesting to unpack further to some extent the evolution of wages. And here in this chart for a selected group of countries for which we have the data, we see the different evolution of real wages from the end of 2019 to the last quarter of 2022, on the left-hand side by level of education of the workers, and on the right-hand side by the level of occupation, from low pay to middle to high pay. And I think it's interesting to note that actually much of the increase in the US in real wages have been observed among the low paid or the low educated, while actually for the other groups, those with the middle level or higher level of education or middle pay and higher pay, there has been some decline. This is to some extent observed also in Mexico. So there has been a significant variation. To some extent, either the adaptation of the minimum wage or deliberate policies to try to protect low-pay workers has helped them to cope better than other workers to the significant increase in inflation. Actually, there is an interesting word that you're probably familiar with by David Autor, that point that these different behavior of wages has led to a compression in the wages in the United States, something that we have not been observing for a significant period of time. So there's been more convergence, if you like, in the wages. And this has led to a decline in the inequality in terms of the wage dynamics, at least in the United States. Now, another important finding in the outlook is also that when we look at the evolution of wages, real wages, but also the evolution of profits, we do observe, not everywhere, not in all countries, and certainly not in all sectors, that in a number of countries / sectors, there has been a stronger increase in unit profit than unit labor cost. That's what is shown in this slide. This is not the case in the US, in which the wage dynamic has been pretty strong already in 2022 and has continued also in 2023, also because of the significant tightness in the labor market, but it's true in a number of countries, in particular among the European countries and also in Australia. Why this is the case? Well, one of the reasons is that there is a staggered effect of wages. Wages tend to react with a delay in changing macroeconomic conditions. In a number of countries, including most of the European countries, wages are set largely through collective bargaining, and collective bargaining are to some extent adapted only over time. They tend to last for 2 to 3 years. So basically some adaptation of nominal wages across sectors and countries is something we do observe already in 2023 and will possibly continue going forward. Now, there is no one story for all countries because you see the difference across the different countries. But one of the messages in our employment outlook is that in those countries where profit have increased more than labor costs, there is some room for profit to accommodate some increase in wages without necessarily generating a wage price spiral. That's an important message because, of course, not only monetary authorities, but actually government themselves are worried about a second round effect from inflation to wages, leading to further pressure on prices on inflation. Now, the evidence so far in terms of nominal wage dynamics, even in the US, and to some extent the possible space for profit to accommodate some increase in wages may suggest that the risk of a wage price spiral is not particularly high so far. Now, much will depend on, to some extent, the negotiation that is taking place in many countries, not only at the company level, but at the sectoral level, especially in European countries, about the wage agreement for the rest of 2023, for 24 and beyond. What we do observe in those countries where this agreement have already been signed is that there is a sort of some adjustment in nominal wages to recuperate at least part of the loss that took place in the past couple of years. But to some extent, there is also a slowdown in the wage dynamics already factored in 2024. To some extent, this collective agreement already foreseen a slowdown in inflation, therefore the need not to have wages rise as much as in 23 as in 24, precisely to avoid the risk of a wage price spiral. So these are some of the highlights of the findings we have in the employment outlook concerning the latest development on the labor market. And now let me pass on the floor to my colleague Steen, who will actually give you the highlights from what is the core of this employment outlook, which is the preliminary evidence, if you like, on the impact of artificial intelligence on the labor market, on jobs.
Thank you, Stefano, and good morning to all. So as Stefano just said, I will present the remainder of the employment outlook, some of the key findings of the impact of AI so far on the labor market, which is clearly very timely given the interest that we've seen recently in artificial intelligence, driven in part by recent developments in generative AI. But I think that's part of a longer term boom that we've seen in the development and also the adoption of these technologies. So as always, when we have these new technologies appear, there's fear about a jobless future. And clearly, this is one of the things that we're monitoring closely at the OECD. In a survey that we did of employers, of 2,000 employers across 7 countries in the manufacturing and finance sectors, from the responses that the adopters have given us, there's no clear indication that AI is having an overall effect on jobs so far. So over half of firms that had adopted AI said that it hadn't had an impact on job levels within the firm. And among the remaining half of employers, it was about an equal share that said it had increased employment, and the other share said it had decreased employment. That also confirms other research that we've done that shows that overall, we haven't seen an impact on employment so far. And I say so far because we're still at the very early stage of adoption. The adoption rates are still relatively low. And we also get some interesting messages back from employers who tell us that, first of all, they don't like firing workers. They like to hold on to workers, particularly in a tight labor market. So they tend to reallocate workers. Also, they tend to rely more on natural attrition, so people retiring or people voluntarily quitting from the firm. And another very interesting finding that we get is that employers tell us that when they adopt AI, they tend to grow without hiring new workers. So the effect of AI on employment levels is something to be monitored closely as we go forward. Another very interesting finding from the research that we've done is that AI can have a positive effect on job quality. In fact, many workers, because we did a survey of workers as well, and many workers told us that they reduced, for example, the dangerous tasks that they did or the kind of tedious tasks that they did and made work more interesting. In fact, if you look at the statistics that we present here, 3 in 4 workers said that AI had helped them improve their performance on the job. And 3 in 5 said that it had increased their enjoyment of work. And we also see very positive impact on physical and mental health. But there are also risks, and so we have updated some of our estimates of the risk of automation in OECD countries, taking into account latest developments in artificial intelligence as well, but also taking into account automating technologies more broadly, because often it's very difficult to disentangle the effects of these. And so what we see is that 27% of employment in OECD countries on average is in occupations that are at high risk of automation. Now, you can see that in the US, this risk is slightly lower, and that will reflect differences in occupational and industrial structure of employment in the US compared to other countries. Workers themselves are also worried about the impact of artificial intelligence on their job. As this graph shows you, this is again from over 5,000 workers that we surveyed in manufacturing and finance industries of 7 OECD countries, including the United States. 3 in 5 workers said that they were worried about the impact of AI on their job in the next 10 years. And in fact, if you look at the very left-hand side of this chart, 1 in 5 workers are very to extremely worried about the impact of AI. And what is interesting is that this percentage is even higher among workers who actually work with the technology. There is some reason for concern, and of course, all of this is just what workers tell us, but we've also asked employers, and what's interesting is that many employers tell us that productivity and reducing staff costs are some of the main reasons for introducing AI technologies. And in the US, I think the share of employers who say this is much larger than in other countries. There are also risks to job quality. We've seen that there's some positive impacts of AI on job quality, but there are also risks. We have 3 in 4 workers telling us that AI has increased their work pace. Also, workers tell us that they're worried about wages in the future. Now, some workers, for example, the workers with AI skills, benefit from AI. They're in high demand. But some workers who are exposed to these technologies and working with these technologies are concerned. In fact, 25% expect no impact on wages in the next 10 years, but nearly 40% expect wages in their sector to decrease as a result of AI in the next 10 years. Even though the impact on jobs overall is not noticeable, at least yet, we do know that jobs themselves are changing and the tasks that workers do are changing. And with this, we also see that the skills that workers require are changing. 50% of the AI users that we interviewed said that AI had made some of their skills less valuable. And for employers also, 2 in 5 tell us that a lack of skills is a major barrier to the further adoption of AI technology. So investing in skills is one of the main policy messages that comes out of the employment outlook. Now, the other thing that we know about training is that the workers who say they've been trained to work with AI are also the workers who are more positive about the impact of AI on their performance and working conditions. The challenge that we all face, and this is not a new challenge, this is a pre-existing challenge, is that there's very high inequalities in access to training. And this chart shows you differences between high-skilled and low-skilled workers in access to training. Another key policy message coming out of the employment outlook is that collective bargaining and social dialogue can have a very positive and important role to play in supporting workers and businesses in this AI transition. In fact, once again, we find that workers who work in workplaces where employers consult them on the adoption of new technologies are workers who are more positive about the impact of AI on their performance and working conditions. However, as we all know, this is an area where there's pressure on labor relations, including in the United States. In fact, in the United States, from our survey, we heard that worker consultation was the least common amongst the 7 countries where we carried out the research. The other thing that's really important with AI, and that's relatively new, or at least magnified by AI, is the importance of AI needing to be trustworthy. We all know that there are challenges around AI regarding privacy, bias, transparency, explainability, accountability. And these are very important things that need to be put in place for AI to be trustworthy, to promote adoption and to promote the safe use of these tools. Now, I provide just one example of where workers are worried. This is one of the questions that was asked in our survey about how worried workers were about their privacy in data collection that happens in the workplace due to AI. And you can see that in many countries, the share at the bottom is a very large share of workers who are concerned about the collection of their data and the invasion of privacy. And again, the United States tends to be on the kind of right-hand side, the worst side, where workers are more worried than in other countries, which could be related to differences in privacy laws across countries. What is clear is that some action will need to be taken, some policy action will need to be taken. I think the OECD was a very early mover in this field by publishing in 2019 the OECD AI principles, which since then have been adopted not only by OECD countries, but also by countries beyond the OECD, including the G20. It's important to understand that AI does not operate in a regulatory vacuum. We have in most countries, we have laws around data protection, privacy, anti-discrimination, workplace health and safety. And to a large extent, it's about asking whether these regulations are still up to scratch, whether they deal with the new challenges that are posed by AI. However, in some cases, we know that countries are already taking AI-specific policy action. For example, in the European Union, we have the AI Act, the proposal around the AI Act, and in the United States, we have the AI Bill of Rights. The final point that I think is worth making, and is a key message from the employment outlook, is that international cooperation on these things will be critical to avoid a fragmentation of efforts and also not to harm innovation on the one hand, and to create regulatory gaps across countries. We, of course, at the OECD, as part of our work, particularly on artificial intelligence and work, innovation, productivity, and skills, will continue looking at some of these issues, as well as to the policy response to the challenges that are ahead. So this is not the end of the conversation on artificial intelligence. So thank you very much for your attention.
Great. Thank you so much. Now we will turn to our moderated Q&A. There's been obviously a lot of developments in AI just over the past year or so. For the survey of workers, for instance, that you referenced, what time period did that cover? I just want to make sure that we're all kind of clear on that to start off with.
Good question. So the survey was carried out in 2022. That is prior to the, of course, the kind of latest wave of generative AI, but already it included some of the questions around language models and chatbots. So those would have been included at that time, at least those that were already available.
Sarah, if I can build on what Stijn just said, Stijn show you sort of this slide with the risk of automation, which is not just artificial intelligence, it's actually the digital transformation altogether. This is based on an in-depth survey we have done with experts of digital transformation and artificial intelligence, asking them, occupation by occupation, which kind of task in this occupation they think that in the next 10 years could potentially be automatable because of the digital progress and also artificial intelligence. So to some extent, at least on this slide, which of course is fraught by a lot of uncertainty because the progress of the technology is very rapid, we actually anticipate what the generative AI could possibly have in terms of tasks that could be automated. So at least that part, the 27% for the OECD countries, potentially include also the impact of the latest development in artificial intelligence, the generative AI. Now, I think we all, even the experts of AI, were caught by surprise about the speed of progress in generative AI. So I think much of the analysis we have done throughout this outlook might, to some extent, potentially underestimate the effect on the workplace of artificial intelligence. But I think it's a good sign of some of the tendency that we do observe. Then, of course, as Stijn said, we keep on reviewing the impact of AI on the labor market. So the work is certainly not finished with employment outlook. We have to continue to monitor that very closely.
Great, thank you. And as Stefano just referenced, generative AI has kind of come back into the news, or really emerged, especially with the launch of ChatGPT last year. I'm curious, and some of our panelists might be able to speak to this, what makes generative AI different from other types of artificial intelligence?
That's a $1 million question. Let me try to a possible answer. In my view, generative AI is not the latest sort of development in artificial intelligence, but to some extent is a signal of where we are going. And I think it is pretty remarkable the speed at which this technology has been entered the market and the use of this technology. I think it's by far the fastest growing consumer tool that we have seen of any of the digital tools that we have observed over the past decades. The second difference compared to machine learning and other AI forms is that it's very pervasive. So basically can be used by all of us, by everyone, and can be used for many, many different purposes. So to some extent, previous generation of AI were more confined to specific tasks and functions in the workplace and beyond. I think generative AI can really have a much more widespread effect, affecting basically all occupation, all jobs. So actually, to some extent, affecting our life, the way in which we, to some extent, gather information, knowledge, and so on and so forth. So it's much more widespread, it's much more pervasive, and it's actually progressing at the speed of light, so very, very rapidly, which again, point to what Stein said at the end. We don't have to reinvent the wheel, but in my view, we have to intervene. We have to put the use of AI in the workplace in a right framework, which is the one of trustworthy AI. Let me just quote a US labor economist, David Otto, that I'm sure all of you know. He actually posed the right question, in my view. Instead of asking what artificial intelligence can do, let's ask what we want artificial intelligence to do for us. And I think this is the right framework to think about, the right approach to think about the framework we want to use to actually find the space, the context in which AI can be used in a trustworthy way.
I would take a somewhat different point of view. I think it's hard to separate the flash of the large language models and generative AI from the real impact on the economy, because I think the place where we're seeing real impact on the economy right now, at least, is in large systems that are typically employed by large companies, and they're doing things like financial analysis or call center support or support for financial advisors or manufacturing planning, some very sophisticated large-scale tasks. ChatGPT goes all over the place. You can access it. It's not that easy, however, to really use it in a productive way. There's a lot that goes into designing prompts, and there's a lot of uncertainty. Now, that may change very rapidly. Maybe we'll get to a point where it becomes a more solid tool, but it makes the comparison between the generative models and sort of the more bread and butter base of a lot of the AI and technology difficult to get at. And in terms of the speed, it's speed in terms of people trying it. We're already seeing a drop off in the number of people accessing ChatGPT. That's natural. People can try it at low or little cost. They're going to experiment with it, until we get to the point where it really has a solid capability to use. It's just not clear, what. Its adoption for actual productive uses is very hard to measure and understand.
Yeah, and if I could just add to those comments, I think Stefano used an important word. He used the word consumer. And if we're talking about related to this technology, and if we're talking about employment, large employers in particular with equities in reputation and in regulatory risk, things like that, are stepping forward very carefully and in a very measured way on the adoption of this technology, because they have issues about the data that is their own proprietary data that's going to be drawn into a a technology involving a large language model and generative AI. They have concerns about dealing with things like intellectual property associated that is in the development of a large language model, which a vendor provides to them. And so, you know, they have to do things like cleansing their own data to make it valid and contemporary for the application. So there are lots of things and quite a long cycle time for large scale system adoption for generative AI for an employer, which is going to you know, have real impact.
I would also say, I think from a worker perspective, it is somewhat like we're living through a live action experiment, right? As this large language model rolls out onto the economy and it's available to all consumers, and employers haven't figured out how they want to implement it or whether they want to implement it. And I think sectorally, you're seeing a lot of different responses. Right now, we have the Writers Guild East and West on strike in the United States, and apparently unable to, at least at the moment, get to an agreement with the employer over how the technology can or will be implemented. I think, you know, we're about to see big bargaining and negotiation between SAG-AFTRA and their employers. The teachers' unions have been very active in trying to understand how to use and implement and train around this technology. And I think broadly, there's a concern in the public sector about sort of subcontracting of public work and of public data into these systems. So there's a lag certainly between the macroeconomic data on job impacts, but we do see across a number of sectors experimentation with ChatGPT and the emergence of a set of questions about how the technology could be implemented, especially the next version of ChatGPT. Can it be tailored? How will it be adapted to particular sectors, right? We think that this calls for consultation. In the United States, we don't have social dialogue in the same way that European countries do, but a real deep engagement, not just with industry or management, but also with workers and their labor unions to really understand the tangible impacts of generative AI, but also predictive AI. I mean, it's all the same stuff at the end of the day. And, you know, certainly there's a lot of conversation about regulation and legislation in the United States. And I think defining really clear processes for the engagement of workers and their representatives is key right now to ensuring trust and setting up a process that can be reliable in terms of how to think about regulating the economic impacts and creating just transition strategies.
Interesting points here. So one of my takeaways from a lot of the comments was that it seems like ChatGPT is sort of this tool that people were impressed by, but are still trying to figure out how to use. And I'm wondering if any of the panelists could kind of expand upon you know, some of the privacy risks, for instance, if you're using ChatGPT or just anything like that, that maybe the average person who is just, you know, using this for the first time might not be aware of.
I think it's basically the privacy issue is scaling up an issue that was already there with the previous sort of waves of artificial intelligence. I think the evidence we are collecting in the survey clearly sort of show that one of the main concerns that many workers have is around the privacy in the use of their data about their performance, how they behave within the company, or even private data, right? And these, I think, as James said, these are large models, which to some extent are easy to verify or to even audit to some extent. Now, ChatGPT is a consumer product that is used by everyone. And of course, access to data may raise a number of issues about privacy. I think David was mentioning the point about intellectual property. So there are many, many more issues that are associated with that. Now, maybe going back to also some of the observation, which actually I tend to agree with ChatGPT or with generative AI, we are in a try and error process. I mean, we all have been trying with that. I think this is true for consumers. It's true also for companies. Of course, companies are not venturing using generative AI like that because of all the issues, all the risks that this might sort of lead to. But I mean, if you look at the ChatGPT and ChatGPT-4, you compare the two, it gives a sense about the progress in this technology, right? If you know that the International Baccalaureate House already allows students to some extent to use ChatGPT in their exam, tells you how this potentially, I say potentially, could change significantly in the way in which we run exams. And the same apply, of course, to the bar exam or to many other things. So, of course, there is a lot of progress that needs to be made. There is a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of bad results that are emerging. But in my view, why we have to collect more information. Again, we're moving from some hard data, the one that we show you in the employment outlook, into more speculation, of course. So when we look at ChatGPT and generative AI, we have to certainly to keep monitoring closely how it is used by consumers and by companies and try to see what is the best policy response. The only thing I would like to share with you is that the idea of wait and see for a few years before we actually intervene might be too late. So I think there are areas, and I think the approach, for example, that the European Union is taking is interesting. I'm not saying it's the only one, but it's interesting because basically it's based on the risk approach. So of course, you know, AI, and in particular generative AI, can be used in many, many different ways by consumers, by companies, and so on and so forth. You can't regulate each and every use of generative AI, but I think at least identify those areas where the use of generative AI can be particularly problematic or can raise significant risks. Well, these are areas in which we have to ask the question, do we have the right legislation in place, or is the legislation we have in place can be implemented to actually cope with the issue raised by generative AI, or do we need additional interventions by companies, by the legislator, can be through hard laws, like the European Union approach, or soft laws, like the US Bill of Rights in the United States. But I think we have to reflect on the evidence, we have to collect more evidence, but at the same time, we have to start thinking seriously about what is the best way to create the right appropriate framework, again, for a trustworthy use of AI.
Yeah, I'd certainly endorse those comments, Stefano. While we don't agree with every aspect of the EU's AI Act, we certainly support its risk-based approach. And that's why we also, in the US, are supporting Senator Schumer's effort to determine the best path for AI regulation and his emphasis on transparency, explainability, intellectual property protection, avoiding bias, and importantly, a focus on those high-risk use cases, and also, frankly, to avoid creating a set of rules that might just benefit 2 or 3 large companies in this space. There are a lot of companies in the AI space, a lot of employers using AI, and there are many other generative AI, large language model products beyond ChatGPT. So I think, you know, we should expand the conversation beyond that particular product, even though it's become the brand associated with the technology. And you know, look, in the US, we don't feel that we need like a super AI agency to regulate everything, all aspects of AI, and we don't need Congress to be licensing algorithms. Rather, we'd see every US agency becoming an AI agency and building its capability. You know, you look at the EEOC, they're investing a lot of time and effort in figuring out the implications of AI for their regulatory span. We think that's the approach to take, and as you say, focus on these high-risk use cases in a meaningful and thoughtful way.
Yeah, I think there's another difference where focusing on ChatGPT might be very misleading, which is, the big installations, the big implications of AI is really continuous with where information technology has been going for the last 3 or 4 decades. And it's increasingly become a game that gets played by the largest firms, and in particular, There's good data now showing that the largest firms have been able to use their information technology advantage to grow their market shares, to become more dominant. We see rising industry concentration, meaning, the largest firms in the industry tend to be growing larger. And this has implications not just for the industrial economy, but also for workers. And there are two that I think are very important and relate to the concerns of the survey. One is that large firms are going to these advanced technologies